Hello and welcome everyone to the first episode of our new podcast series, where we are going to bring together CEOs, COOs of different companies and basically open a discussion on current issues, current trends we see in the utility sector, with the kickoff actually of this series, where we will be interviewing our own COO, Ennio Neumann-Senese, recently appointed, one year in now, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct.
Welcome, Ennio.
Yeah, my pleasure.
First of all, Ennio, would you for those of the listeners that don't know you yet, could you please introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your background and how you got to becoming the COO of UMS Group.
Okay, well, you got a day. Really, I started with UMS back in October last year, and the background to this was my ongoing conversations with Jack Sherman, the founder and CEO of UMS, which is a very, very compelling, intriguing personality. I think Jack Sherman is one of the most knowledgeable people in the utility sector that I've ever seen. So I was very impressed, and he had very strong ideas, and I was on a moment in my life where I was thinking, okay, so what I'm going to do when I grow up? Am I going to be an independent consulting doing a bit of work here, a bit of work there, or do I enter into a small boutique where I can contribute to the growth and basically enhance the proposition and bring out the jewels of the basement, as I call them, that UMS definitely has? And would that be my choice? So it became, of course, the latter option. Jack and I very quickly agreed on the terms, and I took the steering wheel as of October last year. And before that, my background and my pedigree, or my guild, if you like, is management consultancy. I do that for about 36 years, probably 36 years. Been with Accenture, A.T. Kearney, Shell for many years, Proudfood, where I've learned the trade many years ago. I spent about 8 years in private equity, setting up new companies, always in the energy sector, so oil and gas, to a lesser extent utilities, and full value chain.
So, hearing that's basically a whole career path for as far as I know, the fossil industry. Having come to UMS Group as a management consultancy, obviously you see the changes happening the last years, the energy transition. Looking back on your last year in UMS, what's the most noticeable about what you've seen in the utility sector?
Well, good question, by the way. The conversion from, let's say, conventional consulting, asset management, optimization, performance, helping companies out on their processes, making them more efficient, and all of that is still very, very valid. But the overhanging, audacious, hairy goal is the energy transition, and the fact that most companies need to be carbon neutral by 2030, or a little bit later, but 2030. The carbon neutrality is going to kick in for many companies in the asset-intensive industries, not just limited to utilities.
And if you look at the energy transition as it's going now, obviously we have the Paris Agreement, we have the 2030, 2050 goals. Looking at the industry from your point of view, are we on the right track?
Yeah, well, what is the right track, right? I mean, if the question is, are we heading for the goals that have been also established in the Paris Agreement? On that one, I have to admit I'm a little bit pessimistic. I just don't see enough movement, enough commitment, enough sense of urgency. I mean, let me give you the example, right? You had this, we had this COP, where was it? Yeah, in Glasgow, right? A great event, and then you see, all those people being flown in with planes, and I even heard the anecdote that people were been driving around in Teslas, but there weren't sufficient sockets with real power, and they were basically powered with diesel generators. I mean, yeah, it was just one of those anecdotes, which for me illustrates there's a lot of lip service, and I don't see sufficient action. The other thing is that I think that the correlation between environment and climate is not sufficiently boosted, because I think the whole world situation, not just the energy transition per se, should be considered in a, let's say, a holistic approach. So we should not just look at one parameter that's a threat to the world and to society, because there are many threats to society and to the world, existential threats, and the environmental issues are not less important than climate change per se. That's, yeah, so that's my line of thinking, and but I don't see too many people having the same thought about it, and especially policymakers, because policymakers are driven by the electorate. The electorate is driven by their wallet and by their concerns. So politics have become a very symptomatic management of sentiments and polls, and then basically real long-term visions for 5, 10, 20 years with implementable steps. That is that doesn't seem to be in place. I don't see it.
And do you think regulatory changes could make a difference in this transition, or should the incentive come from somewhere else?
Well, everything in life, every process in life has a value chain, right? So incentives could be part of the value chain to achieve a certain objective. The regulator is important, but who drives the regulator? What motives do the regulator have to install, impose, or mandate new regulations onto society, onto companies? Who's going to pay for it at the end? There are many questions, and I personally, but that's my personal belief, and I don't represent my company because, by the way, this is a personal interview, right? So I think I have a little bit of more liberal look at this. I don't think that the regulator should be imposing all kinds of things, especially when they are not done from a holistic perspective. But yeah, I mean, it also depends on the jurisdiction where you are, which country do you live. If you live in a place where everything is highly privatized or commercialized, it's a different discussion as when you are in a highly regulated country. The Netherlands used to be a very highly regulated country, and there are less so, but the regulation level is still very much there, right? So people still expect the government and the state to take care of things. Mm-hmm. Whereas in other countries, the US as the first one, that's not necessarily the case so much there.
Part of the energy transition is the phasing out of carbon emissions, obviously. For a country that's not heavily regulated, that doesn't have that governmental body that says we need you to phase out, we want you to phase out before a certain time, what could be their incentive to phase out anything carbon emitting?
Yeah, again, another good question. Yeah. Okay, so it's commercial, right? If people see that eventually, over the longer term, hydrocarbons are become more expensive, It's what we already see now. So that automatically will create the urge to think differently, to look for alternative sources of energy.
But do you mean this in the form of more expensive coal or gas, or do you mean more expensive emissions, as in emissions being taxed?
But you just said in a non-regulated environment.
Fair enough.
Okay. So in a non-regulated environment, it's commercial. It's driven first and foremost because if you live in a non-regulated environment, as some states of the US are, for example, you automatically the mentality of the people is, first of all, is basically asset-driven, is money-driven. If this becomes really expensive, we can no longer afford it, so therefore we have to change. And by the way, the emissions eventually are causing havoc in our environment, and therefore, over the longer term, we may impact negatively the quality of the lives of our children and grandchildren. So that may be like a calling type of motivation, where the other one is more an ambition to spend as little as possible on energy, right? So that's what I think would trigger. And by the way, you already see it, because places like California and to some lesser extent Florida, they have already developed a lot more alternative and renewable strategies on energy with solar and wind, more than other states in the US do, I think. And well, in Europe, it's already a lot more than they thought they would be having 10 years ago. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you see, or who would you call out as the most, or the key drivers in this energy transition?
Key drivers in the energy transition. I think society. And society, of course, then what is society? Society is the makeup of people, companies and entities and everything else. But I think this is a public-driven initiative, and the academia not to forget. And of course, what you also see is that almost any urgency in the world is sometimes hijacked by who is in power, just to force some changes to gain a better side or more control. I know this sounds sometimes a little bit awkward, but that's also the case. If sometimes you see governments that would have never embraced these policies are now, really embracing these policies, and I sometimes doubt their motives. Really, is it really for the environment, or is it because that's a way of mapping, the standards of where people are, really, and even probably increasing a level of control as well. But generally, I think the initiative is driven by ideology first, and that's how most of these initiatives are basically come to fruition.
Yeah, and then what you're saying is we can see this motivation, this society-driven motivation, will reflect in how a company positions itself in the energy transition, because they'll respond to whatever society's demands or wishes are.
I don't know if they respond to whatever the demands are, but they are definitely, okay, let me give you an example. A major oil company, right? Back in the days, not too long ago, there were NGOs like Greenpeace, who were with all kinds of actions, basically protesting against an oil company. Now, most of the cases was kind of won, if you can call it like that, by Greenpeace. Why? Because they got the attention, and it was negative attention for the oil company, and the oil company then had to basically come with statements. And why? Because in the public domain, if the opinion is negative, it has an impact on the share value as well, because publicly quoted companies are suffering from those type of things too. So there are some levers there that in the public domain are used and sometimes, in my mind, abused as well.
And looking at that change, looking at that transition, and kind of bringing it back to our playing field, what would you consider, or how do you think the utility of the future should position itself? What is the utility of the future in your eyes?
Well, let's start by saying that there are certain basic needs for everything, right? So electricity is a critical part of that. So no matter what the utility of the future is, the output will always be electricity. So if you do a bit of reverse engineering and take in consideration the variables that we have, so we need to be carbon neutral, let's say in 20, 30 years. We need to produce electricity. Currently we have, as renewables, we have, or let's say sustainable, we have solar, wind, we have tidal, we have geothermal, we have likely we are going to have hydrogen as well, right? But there's a discussion, the brown, green, or gray, green or blue hydrogen sources. That's still open for debate. So the utility of the future will be surfing, and it would require probably more flexibility than there is today. The utility sector especially is a very conventional, I would say almost old-fashioned, a little bit like the oil industry. Old industry, conventional industries, difficult to change. And the change here is that the agility to be able to digest any new technology and embrace any new technology and getting it on the grid, transmitted and distributed, that's the key. So the agility in the industry, in the utilities of the future, I think is the key element. Because now, CapEx planning is like 10, 20 years. So you want to build a gas-fired, well, until a couple of years ago, you made a plan for a gas-fired power plant, and you know that was going to last for 30, 40 years maybe, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the technology, and you just need to make sure that it can be done more efficiently over time, but the basics remain the same. So now it's changing because we don't know in 10 years or 20 years how hydrogen is going to evolve. I share the scenario of us not needing cables anymore because we have fuel cells in our house that can power, that can generate the electricity for a house. And then you just change it, and then a truck passes by and they swap the fuel cell, and that's it. So it would be a completely different industry and a different type of market approach, I suppose. But most of all, from a technological perspective, it would require a major change. So and probably also the business model at the end, or at the beginning.
You mentioned agility a few times, also technological changes needed. I want to touch up on digitalization in the energy sector. Obviously, we see a lot of progress there. We see the Internet of Things. We see more sensor technology. We see a lot of big data being used. Do you think digitalization can be an accelerator for the energy transition?
Okay, let me go back to one of the things you said, a lot of progress. Okay. I see a lot of innovation. I'm not sure whether all the innovation is progress, because we are now already faced with companies that have data lakes. The dependency on software providers to make, digestible soup out of the data lake increases. Yeah. The technology required to manage all that data is enormous. The clarity in decision making for processes is very difficult, because you always find that, at least the situation today, is that many major or even smaller utility companies, but also energy, also oil and gas, anyone covering a full chain has these challenges of having many systems and not necessarily having all the right output, because data is nothing if you cannot turn it into information, and information is nothing if you cannot turn it into intelligence. The intel which we need for proper decision making, whether you talk about generation of information or data, that, for example, the drone technology, I think that is very valuable, but it still needs to feed into a system. The system needs to elaborate, needs to join conclusions, and then there is intel that basically says, maintenance, yeah, risk maintenance, or basically the type of maintenance that you do when there is an outage, and you base that on the data that is, for example, provided by drone surveillance, for example. Mm-hmm. And that is just one minor thing, and there are so many technologies out there that now can do asset control, verification, technical inspections, etc., that you really have to be, that the robustness of the systems is a challenge, and this is what we all already notice now. There is a big challenge, and digitalization at the end, I think it's unavoidable. It is important. It's there, but people have to get to agreement how that looks like, and there is insufficient agreement. There is a lot of, let's say, California in 1800 type of mentality. You go out there, you develop new things, you bring new tools to the market, people like the tools, and then let's see which one comes out stronger, and then others that have also come up will slowly vanish from the scene. So and I think that can be done a lot more efficient and without too much expenditure. If you, again, I use the word again, do the reverse engineering. How do you wish to make your decisions, and what type of data do you wish to make your decisions? What decisions are required in real time? What type of decisions can you make over a longer period? And how does the information come to you? And you take it from there, and you then basically reverse engineer it back into your assets to see how and what it is that you really need.
So what would be the right order then? Would you define your data strategy based on your maintenance approach, or would you base your maintenance approach on your data strategy?
Well, maintenance is just one part, right? There are many decisions that you need to take, especially when you're a major company or an integrated utility company, mm-hmm. or an integrated oil and gas company, integrated energy company. Especially when companies are integrated, it is much more than maintenance only. You need to make decisions on many things. You need to make decisions on capital expenditure. You need to make decisions on decommissioning or commissioning of new assets, or decommissioning of assets, divestments, whether some of your assets are still part of your, belong to your core strategy, or do you want to change that? There are many questions that are to be answered, and it's definitely beyond maintenance.
Don't you think it's a matter of maturing, basically a matter of time before that solves itself out?
Yeah. Well, everything is a matter of time. So here we are. This one is also a matter of time. We'll sit this one through, right? One could argue, but that did not bring much good to many countries. If you look in the history and development of places like Venezuela, or even South America, if we take Venezuela, Argentina, but even states in the U.S., right? If we just sit it through, and we just carry on with business as usual without proper planning, I don't think that time will, will resolve it, because it will end up in companies going broke. It will end up in outages. You need to plan your journey. Yeah, and what I think is that a lot of companies, but not just companies, also people, it's micro and macro, do not plan their journey. I think you have heard me saying one time, if I'm in Southampton with my boat, I want to sail to New York, right? So I know where I want to go, to New York, and that is already very important. I know that I cannot fix my journey because I cannot control weather conditions. Well, at least I cannot. Maybe other people can, but I cannot control. So I know that that's the journey, that's the course. But events may come in and kick in and throw me off course. Mm-hmm. But at the end, I have my objective, I have my goal, and I will get there. And I see a lack of visionaries in the industry. I see a lack of visionaries in general. There are a couple, and they write books, and then that's it. But you don't find them in the top, let's say, top 100 blue chip companies in the world. You don't find real visionaries who can actually say, New York is where we go. We depart from Southampton. There's not too much out there that basically gives that type of idea. And if that isn't in place, then you work with people who have 3 to 4 year assignments and then go and do another job. People are not necessarily entirely committed. Yeah, in Shell we call it the hearts and mind. Mm-hmm. So you need both. Commitment doesn't come from the mind only; it also comes from the heart. And I don't see sufficient people, leadership, being committed with the heart to the objectives that they should be defining for themselves.
But in that context, wouldn't our New York at the moment be the Paris Agreement goals? And don't we just lack a captain to get us there, or multiple or basically we miss a whole crew? In your opinion, if I'm putting words in your mouth?
Yeah, you do. No, so we don't lack the crew. You always have good crews. You always have good team members, but you need to have a game plan, right? And in the game plan, everyone has their position and they know what to do. And if everyone is committed with hearts and minds, mm-hmm. then you will get the result. Okay, that's fairly simple. I see. The objectives are clear, right? The energy transition is that you ask for the Paris Agreement. For me, the Paris Agreement and the energy transition is an objective that should catalyze sustainability. Mm-hmm. It is just one milestone, because at the end, it's not about the energy transition. It's not about climate or about environment alone. It is about creating a sustainable world, and these are critical factors on that path. But they're not alone, right? Mm. There is a lot more to look at. So if a certain objective that the whole world can stand behind, okay. It's about sense of urgency, right? So if we now would be invaded by a extraterrestrial fleet, I think the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Chinese and the Americans, they would all be focused on, mitigating the threat that basically is on all of us, right? And that's the sense of urgency. That's the sense of urgency that you need to mitigate the threats of the climate change and the environment.
Do you see a difference in sense of urgency between, let's say, the millennial generation and younger, and the generation that comes after that, generations that come after that?
I'm not entirely sure about the generations that come after that, because I am I'm a little bit disconnected. I have grandchildren, and when I talk to them, they have the same concerns as I had when I was 6, right? But the youngsters, the teenagers, are very concerned with what's happening in society, and that's not just what I notice. It's not limited to climate change and environment alone. Never mind Greta. Greta Thunberg. I think she is, she started off in ingenuity, and then of course she becomes like a used puppet as well. That's clear. And I don't count her as a representative for the youth anymore. The youth I see is the folks in the street that cannot do many things that I could do when I had their age, and they know, right? So, and therefore they are concerned. And by the way, I'm concerned as well for the same reason. And with the, let's say, the millennials, they also have these concerns because they are thinking about maybe having a partner, getting married, maybe children, the traditional things. And there are too many variables out there that makes it, that creates a lot of uncertainty. Climate is just one of them, but the current way governments are dealing with the corona situation is the same. It adds up to this one. So at the end, I am concerned, I am worried for the next generations, especially because we have this compartmental approach to key issues in the world.
What would your advice be to this concerned generation? If this was your last hour on Earth and this is your last message, what would you tell that up and coming generation? Those.
Okay. Well, when people say these things to you, if it would be your last hour, your last moment on Earth, in Italy we say knock on wood.
Apologies.
But I think the first advice is that be critical, be a critical thinker. Don't take anything for granted. Not the information that you are faced with. Make sure that you are comfortable with the things that you see and that you learn, and try to make decisions based on on as many parameters as you can get. Be concerned. Be concerned for the environment, and climate change. People say, we have to mitigate climate. No, we cannot mitigate climate change. We will not be able to mitigate climate change. The one thing that we have to do is getting plans in place for over 20, 30 years when climate changes and how that is going to affect the place where we live. I was making a joke a couple of months ago. I was saying to people, I'm going to buy a piece of land in Siberia. Oh, Siberia, yeah, because I think my great-grandchildren will have a nice villa at the Riviera of Siberia, because that's what climate change is going to cause, likely, if I believe the scientists, right? So rather than arguing and fighting over, climate change, we need to mitigate as much as we can, everything that contributes to climate change. But actually, rather than the emission discussion, I would be even more focused on environment, but I said that in the beginning. So for me, environment is the key enabler to mitigating climate change and cope with the consequences of climate change. And rather than focusing purely on climate change and forget about the rest, the plastic ocean and not recycling enough and etc. I'm also concerned about our earth minerals. I'm concerned if we want to, if recently we did a little bit calculation on the back of an envelope on what the environmental impact that Tesla really has. When everyone says, we need to drive with electricity, etc. Yeah, cool. But let's look at the environmental footprint of a Tesla. It's scary. It's really. I never thought that, but it has an impact. And there's so much more that has a negative impact on the environment. But we're all about climate change. It becomes the flavor of the day. It is now a commodity to talk about climate change, and and pay lip service to the objective. But at the end, the environment is the key, at least in my mind, the key to change.
Right, and how would you define the role of consultants? Because that's what we are. How would you define the role of consultants in that context?
Yeah, well, in that context, Okay, so as consultants, we are not driving the bus, right? So we are telling the bus driver what the best way is to drive the bus, and maybe change position, or maybe, well, they don't smoke anymore, but never mind the example of the bus driver. But we are not driving the bus. So we are advising the bus. If they ask us to drive the bus, we probably could drive the bus as well. And we probably would also invent a new route rather than the one that he was going on, to make it more efficient. As a matter of fact, consultants have been involved in inventing bus routing and train routing, but never mind. So there are 3 levels. One is strategic, the second is tactical, and the third one is operational. And all levels have a requirement for continuous improvement, have a requirement for reflection, have a requirement for external support. Why? Because consultants not just bring their skill set, but they also bring the experience of other clients into their work, right? So from a strategy perspective, helping clients mapping the strategy for the future is a role for consultants. How to convert strategy into operations is a role for consultants. Sorting out what digitalization really means to the industry is one. The energy transition, given the fact that that is a real topic and it's unavoidable, the role for consultants, at least our kind of consultants, would be to help companies identify or basically establish whether they are on the right track. Because if this is the track, and they are going here, the gap becomes enormous if there is no intervention at an early stage. So we are probably well positioned to reach out and help clients identifying where they are on the journey and help them correcting the journey, and not only saving zillions of euros or dollars, regardless, depending where you are, but also making the process more valuable and more efficient, and reaching the objective that at the end has been placed upon them.
Lastly, Ennio, because we're getting to the end of this podcast, where do you see UMS Group? Where do you see yourself in 3 years' time, looking from now?
Okay. Okay, I see UMS Group. UMS always, since inception, I think UMS always had a unique position in the utility sector. I still think it's a unique company. There is no one alike out there with the knowledge that UMS can bring to clients. It's absolutely superb, and 30 years of benchmarking experience can also help companies to basically calibrate their journey when it comes to the energy transition, for example, but even for major transformation projects that some of these companies are unfolding. We can play the pivotal role to either be successful or to fail, right? And there's too much at stake for companies not having us, but yeah, I'll leave that to those companies. That's one. So I see UMS in growing and diversifying in the next 3 to 5 years. That's what I see with increased specialisms on our global learning consortia, which is the benchmarking peer-to-peer groups where they do not only benchmark but also exchange ideas with each other. And we we facilitate that, and I see that growing significantly. On the consulting part, I see a lot of strategy requirements that require specific insights in order, data, information, intel, to get to define and help company strategies to execute the journey of the energy transition. And then there is operational. There are many operational issues out there that could be streamlined, whether it's in operations, maintenance, and the networking. Yeah. So I think on all three levels, there is a lot of work to do for UMS and probably also for many other consultants, but especially the requirement, the knowledge requirement, and the what I would say the 30 years of intelligence that UMS has gathered has not been paralleled by anyone. So I think the leverage for UMS knowledge is there to bring that more prominently to the market. I see that as my task as well, by the way.
Thank you very much, Ennio.
My pleasure. Thank you for the interview.
It's been wonderful listening to you. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for kicking off this podcast series. And I think this is going to be a successful podcast show.
I sure hope. The idea is that we at the end, the idea is that we're going to have these executive interviews. This one is a kickoff, is an example. We need to see how it works out. But my idea is to have these high-level interviews with CEOs. And it's not just about the nitty-gritty operations. It's really about vision. I would like to hear the vision of those people who are leading companies and therefore leading regions, leading nations, leading people. It's leaders of the world, and it's not the ones that are elected. These are the companies that basically design our future, right? So it is important to know what those people think, and I would love to have these interviews with these people. And I, would like to launch this first series of 12 executive interviews, and this one is the kickoff, just to test it on myself first. So thank you again. The questions were excellent. You were well prepared. So
set the bar high.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the next episode.
Likewise.